All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, Marco Rubio, who is clearly once again positioning himself as a presidential contender, is out with some actually pretty interesting new comments. In an interview with Axios, the Florida senator said that he believed that the future of the Republican Party is based on a multi-ethnic, multiracial, working-class coalition, adding an admirable word of caution here, saying, "We still have a very strong base in the party of donors and think tanks and intelligentsia from the right who are market fundamentalists who accuse anyone who's not a market fundamentalist of being a socialist to some degree. If the takeaway from all of them is now is the time to go back to the sort of traditional party of unfettered trade, I think we're going to lose the base as quickly as we got it. We can't just go back to being that." Now, a lot has been made of Trump's improved performance among minority voters, and with a lot of justification. Mainstream media and what Chuck Rocha likes to call woke white consultants have long assumed that demographics are destiny, that they didn't really have to actually do anything to appeal to a young, diverse coalition of the ascendant in order to achieve increasingly large wins and transform the American political landscape. Clinton operative James Carville even penned a book based on this premise titled 40 More Years After Obama Was Elected, and just before a massive Tea Party wave and decade-long obliteration of Democrats in rural America, leading to the loss of some 1,000 plus state legislative seats. Don't worry, though. He was still rolled out on MSNBC to trash Bernie Sanders in the primary based on the record of his sage advice. Meanwhile, as Democrats lost ground with minority voters, Trump actually lost ground with the white working class men who were supposed to form his unshakable base of support. And I, of course, can't help but enjoy both of these outcomes for how inconvenient they are for Democrats' assumption that the hollow identity politics of throwing Kamala Harris on the ticket and kneeling in kente cloth would be enough to guarantee large minority majorities indefinitely. And also, I enjoy for how inconvenient it is for Republicans who assume that their program of plutocracy plus white identity politics plus saying the word worker a lot would be sufficient to keep their own base in line. But now, there's a sort of weird reverse inevitability argument taking hold, which I think is equally fanciful. We could call it the coalition of the descendant theory, in which Democratic dominance in the suburbs with educated, affluent white voters, combined with the modest gains of Trump among minority voters, set the parties on a new inevitable path in which the GOP is destined to become a populist, multiracial, working-class bastion as the Democrats shift into occupying the previous positioning of the Republicans as the party of the rich. Now, of course, there are a lot of obvious problems with this idea. First and most obviously, have you actually met the Republican Party elites? They almost uniformly oppose a federal minimum wage, are obsessed with ideas like cutting Social Security and Medicare. They champion health insurance schemes that would lead to millions fewer having coverage, and they have waged an all-out war against the one institution of actual working class power, that being the labor movement. Every one of them came up through a system of funding and indoctrination run by wealthy, radical libertarians. What's more, it is completely clear that in a Biden administration, they will immediately snap into 2010 Tea Party mode, excitedly crowing about wasteful government spending and obnoxious racially tinged talking points about lazy freeloaders and makers and takers. Just as the Democratic Party has a problem with their addiction to contempt for white working class Americans, the Republican Party has a problem with their addiction to contempt for black and brown working class Americans. Anyone remember that whole Obama phone situation?
How do you think it got this tight?
Because it's a changing country. The demographics are changing. It's not a traditional America anymore. And there are 50% of the voting public who want stuff. They want things. And who is going to give them things? President Obama. He knows it, and he ran on it. And whereby 20 years ago, President Obama would have been roundly defeated by an establishment candidate like Mitt Romney. The white establishment is now the minority.
You think all that crap is gone? Of course not. The trope of the lazy black welfare queen is as deeply ingrained in conservative ideology as tax cuts and deregulation. So, given that issue, it won't surprise you to learn that when you dig into the numbers from 2020, there actually appears to be a very strong class dynamic at play. Jacobin's Matt Cart first brought these numbers to my attention, by the way, and we have an interview airing with him over the weekend where he dives deeper into them. But basically what he found is this. The overwhelming majority of Trump's gains with Latino voters nationally came among the most affluent group. In other words, Trump, who campaigned aggressively against socialism and whose most clear economic agenda for the second term was tax cuts and deregulation, appealed most to exactly who you would expect: those Latinos whose class interests align best with a standard Reaganomics type agenda. This is quite clear in Miami-Dade, but plays out in data across the country. Now, the dynamic in the Rio Grande Valley along the southern border doesn't fit into this more generalized trend, and I think that that's really important to note. It wouldn't surprise me here if Trump's aggressive law and order messaging may have held particular appeal along the southern border, accounting for some of those gains. The Atlantic had a good piece about Trump's Latino outreach that really makes a lot of sense. They write that there was already a sizable chunk of partisan Republican sentiment among Latinos, and that Trump's administration built on existing Republican support by relentlessly courting Latinos since 2017, focusing on his economic policies and support for religious freedom. Even as Trump made family separation and the border wall central parts of his platform, the White House engaged Latino business owners early and often. Trump lowered taxes, he slashed financial regulations, and named a Latina Small Business Administration administrator who helped Latino business owners. Overall, Trump seems to have won Latino voters not with some new populist message, but with traditional conservative messaging on low taxes, abortion, law and order, and Red Scare. The fact that this message predictably landed best among the affluent cuts against the notion that the GOP is headed in a populist working class direction. The picture among black voters is a little more complicated, frankly. By and large, there actually wasn't a large shift towards Trump over 2016, and the class dynamics weren't nearly as clear-cut as they were with Latinos. But I did think that these numbers were interesting. Trump dramatically outperformed with black voters who felt that their financial situation had improved over the past 4 years. In other words, he was effective in his messaging to those who felt they had been upwardly mobile during his time in office. Now, the truth is, I'd genuinely be happy to see the Republican Party really take the interests of working people of all races seriously, drop their identity-based contempt, and work across the aisle on issues like corporate power or wages or labor rights. Unfortunately, there's almost no evidence that the working class future that Marco Rubio talks up is anything more than a hot new branding exercise at this point for DC Republicans. And although you know how critical I am of the Democratic Party, they at least do embrace some basic pro-working class economics like a minimum wage hike, better healthcare access, and an indifferent attitude towards labor rather than an outright hostile attitude towards labor. What's more, unlike the right, there is a genuine left-wing grassroots movement that requires its political leaders to reject corporate money and back universal programs. Unfortunately, of course, the Democratic Party has embraced and prioritized the politics of the affluent suburbanite instead of this multiracial young working class base. As a result, the sad truth today, neither party is a working class party. Workers are very likely to remain divided, primarily along racial and cultural lines. And as long as we are stuck in that static polarization, elites will continue to gain no matter which party happens to be in power. And sad to say that I think that is the most likely dynamic we are going to see play out over the next few years, because it's the easy one for these parties. They don't have to do anything. If it's all culture war, and you're just dividing people by, like, we're going to play to our identity politics, we're going to play to our identity politics, that's all you have to do ultimately. You don't actually have to deliver for anybody. You just divide the country in these, like, racial, ethnic, and cultural terms.
I would, just one caution is on the exit polls, which is that our future guest, Jane Coaston, will talk a lot about this. But the exits this time around are off. But look, I don't doubt that that is likely the case. This again gets to something I think we talked about right after the election, which is something I've been thinking a lot about. The term working class is become a misnomer at this point because nobody really understands what it means. And I have decided to accept the definition that the dividing line is the 4-year college degree. And I don't think income is the way to look at it. And the reason why is, let's say you're an upwardly mobile, basically Republicans won the upwardly mobile part of the working class.
Yeah.
Upwardly mobile people who do not have a 4-year college degree and do not work in the service class industry, right?
Yeah.
So, or service as a business, the way that you work in an office job. I mean, so does that mean that they're working class if they're making more than the average median income? I would say yes, because I think that's something that is a cultural affect.
So this is people who basically feel like if things continue in this direction, they're going to be okay.
Exactly. And so this is, again, where I think the dividing line is that four-year college degree institution more than anything. And so that's where I think the future lies for the party, is for the 60% of people who didn't go to four-year college degree, along with, the people who generally align on culture. And I think that thinking of it as a cultural affect is more interesting, because if you go look at your Trump 2016 exits, the verified exits that were released in 2018, a fifth of the people who voted for him were pro-choice. And I think about that a lot. 1/5 of Americans voted for a person who, look, on policy, no question, most pro-life president in probably modern American history. And so then how many people who were pro-life voted for the Democratic Party? It was like 5%. So I think what it tells me is that the cultural crossover of the right and of a Trumpian-like politician, like Marco, if he wants to decide to cast himself that way, or anybody in the future, has a much better grasp of being able to pull people into that coalition. So what you want to do is push down the amount of people, right now you're rating upwardly mobile. That's not the majority of the working class Americans. Well, if you push that down significantly and you have your existing coalition, that's millions more votes.
Yeah.
So I think that is really where the future is. But look, you're right. I mean, the beating heart and the soul of the Republican Party right now is libertarian ideology. But to me, the beating heart of the Democratic Party is cultural liberalism. All working agenda is subject to that. I mean, I think about Bernie all the time. Bernie was consistent on everything in his life except for three things: gun control, immigration, and it was gun control, and it was immigration, and it was abortion. He endorsed a pro-life candidate. He was generally fine with it. He moved on gun control, and he became an open borders person, even though he was an immigration restrictionist for his entire life. That tells me the power of cultural liberalism.
Yeah.
You will always subject your economic power to that ideology. I don't know, maybe, if the Republican ideology is as much of a religion as cultural liberalism. I suspect it's not.
I think it is.
Maybe.
I mean even from what you're pointing out about the crossover vote, those cultural issues are so hot button and they drive so many votes within the Republican coalition. And again, it's easy for them. So when I look, though, at the Republican Party, it's okay, these people don't even support, they may say worker, they don't even support a minimum wage. They hate unions. There's no evidence in their policy that they really intend to change on economics whatsoever. And a lot of the political landscape is set up at this point for them to revert back to exactly what they were before. And even when you consider, Trump he's apparently talking about running in 2024, wouldn't surprise me whatsoever if he went out and did that. But Trump himself has already changed on those issues. He has imbibed the libertarian-fueled ideology. So he's a much different candidate than he was when he first started to run. So even for him, if the party were to return back to him in 2024, I don't know that would be a benefit to them in terms of moving their economic ideology either. So then you just end up with, why do Democrats who are their economic positions are way more popular than Republicans, way more popular. Joe Biden gets blown out in Florida and $15 minimum wage, which he claims to support, wins 60%. It's because of exactly what you're talking about. It's this cultural, Matt Karp, actually, in that interview, he called it the aroma of elitism.
Yeah, he's
and
right.
I think that's right. But the Republicans have their own version of that, which is what I was talking about, which Democrats' aroma of elitism is especially directed at white working class voters. And Republicans have an addiction to that aroma of contempt and elitism towards the black and brown working class and have over decades.
Completely agree with you.
Are either of those parties going to let go of those pieces that have helped them keep in line their coalition? I think it's unlikely.
Yeah. I mean, in the short term, yes. In the long run, I literally have no idea.
Anyone's guess.
Yeah.
And I genuinely cheering for anybody to pick up the mantle. Seriously, 100%. I don't care. I don't care if it's the Democrats or somebody stand for something that's going to change something in this country and actually bring working class people together. Do I see that on the horizon? No, I do not.
I think that's a fair point.
Next on Rising, President Trump has repeatedly alleged voter fraud in Georgia with literally no evidence of that. And yesterday, the Georgia Secretary of State announced a hand recount of ballots for the presidential race. Team Rising is going to weigh in on all of those developments. That's next.